related. I think Miriam cited for giving me this history and clarifying it. There are false accounts on the web. Miriam knows. Okay. Most people know the name of Martin Buber in relation to his ethics of I and thou, or at least the book by that name. His was an ethics that claims that one human should treat another not as an object, but as someone who can be addressed directly, and with whom a form of communication considered spiritual might take place. If Kant thought people should be treated not as a means to an end, but as an end itself, Buber recast that particular ethics in terms of the scene of address. A person should be someone who is addressed, that is, who is considered to be addressable, one to whom I can and would direct my speech, and one who is in some sense acknowledged by that very address as someone who deserves to be addressed. Buber wrote a rather remarkable essay called Zionism and Zionism, both of them using scare quotes a lot during these times, Zionism without scare quotes and then Zionism in scare quotes, in May of 1948, 2 weeks after David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel and became its head of state. Scare quotes once again. In this essay, he is distinguishing himself quite radically from Ben-Gurion and from what he calls the political Zionists of the time. In a manner reminiscent of Said, or perhaps we could say prefiguring Said, Buber writes, and here I quote, "From the beginning, modern Zionism continued two basic tendencies which were opposed to each other in the most thoroughgoing way, an internal contradiction that reaches to the depths of human existence," end quote. He explains that, I quote again, one can comprehend the two tendencies at the origin as two different interpretations of the concept of national rebirth. The first tendency, he tells us, understands rebirth as requiring the return to and the restoration of what is called the true Israel. This would involve a return from exile for the Jewish people. Accordingly, rebirth would be understood as the renewal and unification of the people as they build their common life with one another. This building or formation process is likened to building a home, but also to giving birth. So laboring in the sense that one labors when one gives birth. According to this first tendency, the point's not simply to secure the existence of the nation, but to pursue what he called fulfillment, understood as a spiritual reawakening or indeed spiritual renewal. And for those of you who know about renewal synagogues, that is the continuation of that early tradition. The second tendency, the one that Buber will clearly oppose, grasps rebirth as normalization and holds that Jewish spiritual renewal requires a land, a language, and independence. Renewal, conceived as normalization, pursues all these goals as commodities, he claims, assimilating to existing notions of property and the nation state. And it's here that Buber's ethical question emerges in the midst of his political problem with Ben-Gurion's declaration of the principle of Jewish sovereignty as the legitimating ground of the State of Israel. There was a battle between 46 and 48. On what grounds should the State of Israel be established? Should it be a binational framework? Should it be Jewish sovereignty? Ben-Gurion won. Jewish sovereignty it was. Buber lost. Buber Magnus lost. Arendt was part of that alternate vision. So Buber now, just weeks after his most terrible political loss, reposes the questions that he understands Ben-Gurion to have refused to answer. How will people live with each other in this land, he writes? What will people say to each other in that language? What will be the connection of their independence with the rest of humanity, question mark. He notes that the advocates for normalization are not interested in such questions. And he imagines the riposte of his Zionist oppositions in a mocking way. Be normal, a state, and you've already been reborn, end of quote. Clearly, Buber was expecting something more from rebirth than a nation state. As early as 1919, Buber became a leading voice in the Jewish renewal movement, one that objected to the dominance of Talmudic studies and rabbinic law, actually probably rabbinic, most specifically. He distinguished between religion and religiosity, contrasting the former, understood as the ritualistic observance of law, with a living, authentic, and creative practice. And here he was not far from Gershom Scholem. He was not alone throughout the 1920s as the Jewish renewal movement grew. Benjamin was affected by it, so was Kafka. He turned away from the Talmud, although not entirely, to mine the resources of Hasidic stories. And Buber developed a notion of living dialogue, which for him was derived from, but exceeded, the practice of Talmudic disputation. Renewal was associated with re-education, but also with the renewal of the Jews as a people. In 1925, he was part of a group called Brit Shalom that was dedicated to, and I quote, absolute political equality of two culturally autonomous peoples, end quote. And then later in 1942, he became part of Ihud, a party whose name translates as union, which focused on forms of social and cultural togetherness between Jews and Arabs. Ihud opposed the partition plan, preferring federated models and joint government, but in the political maneuvering of May 48, Ben-Gurion's Yishuv vanquished Ihud. For Buber, this was the beginning of the end of Zionism, as he had known it. Indeed, Zionism lived for him up until that moment, and then with the triumph of political Zionism in 1948, Zionism has to be talked about in quotation marks. Right? So post-48, Zionism is in quotation marks. But from the beginning, he was concerned to provide an alternative to nationalist understandings of the Jewish people by turning to the idea of a living commitment to dialogue. In 1938, he was forced to leave Germany, emigrated to Palestine, where he took up residence in Jerusalem, in that fateful building on Brenner Street. And in the 10 years prior to writing this essay, he found himself in several conflicts with the Orthodoxy on the grounds that his religious writings were heretical, but also with the nationalists, whose views he regarded as dangerous for Zionism. In May of 48, when he wrote this small essay, Buber supported the idea of the rebirth of the Jewish people only 3 years after the end of the Nazi genocide. But he worries that the project of rebirth had been stolen and renamed by those who have deprived Zionism of its ethical and spiritual meaning. He objects, for instance, to the crude forms of nationalism indulged by his political opponents, which includes compulsory forms of assimilation for recent immigrants and settlers from Europe. And at one point, in his rather short and angry text, he offers the following reminder to Ben-Gurion as follows, quote, "This land is not today devoid of inhabitants, as it was not in those times in which our nation trod upon it as they burst forth out of the desert. But today we will not tread upon it as conquerors. Today we are not obliged to conquer the land, for no danger is in store for our spiritual essence or our way of life from the population of the land." And then he goes further. "Today we are permitted to enter into an alliance with the inhabitants in order to develop the land together and make it a pathfinder in the Near East, a covenant of two independent nations with equal rights, each of whom is its own master in its own society and culture, but both united in the enterprise of developing their common homeland and in the federal management of shared matters," end quote. Finally, then, Buber sounds off against the very principle of Jewish sovereignty. The normalizing view of Zionism that he opposes asks only for sovereignty for the Jewish people, but it fails to accept the importance of two peoples, Jews and Palestinians, on that land. He calls them Jews and Arabs. In other words, the declaration asserts sovereignty at the expense of cohabitation, and Buber finds that unjust. He writes, in contrast to this, his own view of Zionism, the protective tendency makes only one demand, sovereignty. If only we can attain sovereignty, he writes in a sardonic tone, referring to the partition plan that established the borders of 48. The life concept of independence, he writes, was replaced by the administrative concept of sovereignty. For Buber, the success of Zionism as a sovereign state outside of a binational and federated authority constituted the defeat of Zionism. It did not imply that Zionism came to an end, but only that one tendency triumphed over the other, and that Zionism would, from that point on, become associated exclusively with Jewish sovereign rule. What Buber valued as Zionism slowly, and indeed most certainly, became a thing of the past. He looked upon Israel with what he calls a torn heart, only 2 weeks old, as a small state built precisely during a time when the sovereignty of small states was diminishing. He understood that the basis of this founding implies that Israel will always be in danger because it stands in perpetual opposition to its geopolitical environment and must apply its best forces to military activity instead of to social and cultural enterprises. But it was clear to him, as it was to Hannah Arendt at the time, that Israel would be bordered in part by a Palestinian population who had been deprived of their rights to land, forced to leave their homes and their homeland, and asked to submit to a new state not of their making. So in the longer version of this paper, I have a kind of disposition on what it means today when people say to you, are you a Zionist? And what it is they mean. And usually what they mean when they say, are you a Zionist? They mean, do you believe in the right of Israel to exist? But they don't just mean that. They mean the right of this Israel, legitimated on the principle of Jewish sovereignty and guaranteed Jewish demographic advantage. Do you believe in the right of this state to exist? And if you want to come back and say, well, actually, I would like to see a different state structure, I believe it would be better for all people, Jewish and non-Jewish, who live there, you're considered an anti-Zionist, or maybe even worse, a terrorist. And you notice that principles of radical democracy are now being called terrorists, so be careful what you say. I read Said and Uber as asking a common question. How is it that any of us address and receive another? Neither took the fact of communication for granted, but for communication to happen, there has to be a world in which you can hear, an audible world, whether that is something that your ears let you do or a set of technologies enable for you. There may have to be a translation from one language to another, and so an able translator. If we cannot seek recourse to another's words, then there is no I and no you, and certainly then no possibility for union, for cohabitation, much less binationalism, or what Buber calls a living relation. As you know, on this topic, it's often quite literally impossible to hear what another says. You've been admirably quiet and undestructive, and I thank you. We think, oh, if another person has that view, I cannot hear what that other person says. Okay. The view can be Zionism or anti-Zionism, since there are people on both sides who shut out any discourse that is perceived to belong to the opposition. Finding a way to speak and a way to hear is essential to any deliberate and reflective consideration of this issue, and yet in speaking about this issue, one runs into a crisis of capability and audibility all the time. What can be spoken and still be heard? What is permitted? What is censored? How is the sphere of audibility restricted so that when I hear certain arguments, I must literally leave the space of that speaking in order to feel okay again, or I must invoke a law to stop that speech? We all have our limits, to be sure, and I have been known to stop speech that I cannot bear listening to. But sometimes a space is opened in which one can come up against those limits on hearing or receiving, abide by the anxiety it produces without reaching for the censor. So part of what I've been doing this afternoon is simply to note that Zionism has a history, has itself undergone several transformations. So when we quickly presume that Zionism seems to be confirmed or refuted on the basis of the question, do you believe Israel has the right to exist, is answered. One important dimension of the history of Zionism is precisely an active set of debates about the grounds that would legitimate such a state. Instead of saying, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist or not exist, what would productively say, what would allow for a legitimate state in that region that would actually grant equality to everyone, regardless of citizenship and national heritage, etc., and race and everything else? I mean, I know it sounds really naive, but that kind of naive hopefulness is actually branded as very dangerous speech, apparently. Okay, we can't even go there. All right. In 29, Buber writes an essay entitled Zionism and Nationalism, in which he tries to distinguish the one from the other. And although that essay has its limitations, it does include the following imaginary dialogue with a nationalist. Quote, you might object, if we do not participate in the necessary politics of power, how can we secure ourselves? How will we secure this settlement, the beginning Volksland in Palestine? To this I reply, Buber replied, no conceivable security is as real as this, to become a power in spirit that can sustain the forms of life among the nations, that can become a living example of relations between the nations, that can help prepare a true covenant between Orient and Occident, and from there, on the basis of this work, form an alliance with the future owners of all nations. I want to point out the difficult balance conveyed by Buber's statement, namely the idea of a living example of relations between the nations. In other words, he's not speaking about an exemplary nation. He's not saying this nation will be the example of democracy in the Middle East. He's saying what ought to become exemplary is a living set of relations, suggesting that what is most living and even what is most exemplary is sustainable interrelationship. He shifts the emphasis off of the nation to its interrelations, and in that sense stands for what we might call the between of nations, right? That relation that links them. So binationalism then in this view is not simply the conjoining of one nation with another, and certainly not the conjoining of one nationalism with another, but the active and exemplary enactment of the relation that holds among them. In 29, he confessed upon a returning from a trip to Palestine, I quote, "Let us beware of regarding and treating as inferior what is foreign to us and not sufficiently known. Let us be careful not to commit ourselves to what has been committed against us. And let it be said again that while self-assertion is a natural precondition of all our actions, it is not enough. It also requires imagination, the ability to imagine the soul of the other, of the stranger, from within the reality of our own. I must not hold back a confession. It was appalling to me to see in Palestine how little we know of the Arab." And he actually writes, "the Arab man," but I'm giving him a break. Yet Buber's notion of imagining the other is not quite the same as a dialogue, recapitulating what Said has called Orientalism. Whatever local dialogues took place with Palestinian cooperative councils failed to call into question the settler project, and Palestinians were regularly regarded as not measuring up to the task of dialogue, and we see this in the continuing Orientalist discourse that claims that there's no partner on the Palestinian side with whom to negotiate a peace. And this inability to stop and reverse the appropriation of Palestinian lands and the dispossession of its peoples remains an abiding limit and failure of Buber's analysis. Moreover, his call for a land of two peoples, Jews and Arabs, he conceives of them as two distinct and homogeneous groups, but 30% of Israeli Jews are from Arab descent, and another 20% of Israelis are non-Jewish Palestinians. How do we understand the opposition between Jew and Arab within this contemporary demographic situation? It means that a good half of Israel is not from European descent, which suggests in turn that the distinction between Arab and Jew rests on a misunderstanding of who is Arab, some Jews are, who is Jewish, some Arabs are. Secondly, the Palestinians are themselves diverse, made all the more so by virtue of their own scattered condition, nearly 5 million now living in exile from the lands they once owned, and where they lived for decades, if not centuries. So does it make sense to talk about two peoples as if they were each so radically distinct and internally homogeneous? Is the notion of a federated or binational state practical for this time? Well, many of those Palestinians who actively argue for a one-state solution are precisely the ones who are committed to living side by side with the Jewish population, and yet the one-state solution is clearly feared by those who think either A, it will produce an Arab demographic majority and dissipate the Jewish character of the state, or B, it will produce one greater Israel and destroy Palestinian aspirations for political self-determination. The most basic limit of Buber's analysis is that he was not able to grasp the colonial dimensions of Zionism, or he had, even worse, a kind of colonial hopefulness. We can become entrepreneurs together. As a result, he didn't understand that a workable binationalism would only be possible on the basis of an end to settler colonialism and a workable plan for reparations. Similarly, we see today how the issue of Palestinian statehood is often debated without considering whether an independent state for Palestinians would be built within the military and economic structures of occupation, which is one form in which settler colonialism continues in and through the state apparatus. Right? So that kind of state would not be altogether helpful. If a Palestinian state incorporates and sustains the occupation, then it is what is called a client state at best, or an